Welcome to Madden 07. Madden 24 is still not out. So I figure instead of making a mini story, let's dive deep into my favorite Madden of all time. I'm going to do this in 4 parts. We're going to make a superstar. We're going to create a team, play with that team, but today, let's go through these rosters. First, go to the Bears. Their highest player was Olin Kreutz, who is one of the best linemen, who I think is underrated. They have Brian Urlacher, who has hair now. But one of the coolest things they have is this guy, Rex Grossman. No one probably remembers this guy. And for good reason. He was a bust. But he was the first Florida Gator quarterback I ever fell in love with as a Gators fan. I'll take you around the league, show you some of my favorite players, this guy included. Roberto Garza, the first Latino player I ever really started enjoying watching. At this point, he was a rookie. If that tells you I enjoyed watching. At this point, he was a rookie. We had Carson Palmer, who was just a few years pro at this time. And at the receiving core, we had Chad Ochocinco himself, TJ Hushmanzada, one of the best 1-2s. This is one of the best cornerbacks at the time, Delta O'Neal. He's one of the highest rated players in the game. Now, the Bills didn't have too many players of note that I remember other than this guy, Willis McGahee. He actually helped me win a fantasy football championship a few years back. This was prior to that. He came out of Miami. Now, this is Champ Bailey. This is another one of the best corners. He is actually one of the members of what they call the 99 Club in Madden. He was one of the best lockdown corners ever that also just got to the Hall of Fame. Oh my gosh, that's right. John Lynch went to the Broncos this year. The longtime Buccaneer. Actually, this was his last year in the NFL. He went to Denver. And the Browns didn't have too many players of note that I remember, other than this guy up here, William McGinnis, 3-time Super Bowl champion with the Patriots. This was also his last year in the NFL as well. Phil Dawson. Phil actually had one of the most unfortunate field goals and most fortunate at the same time, where it doinked off the crossbar on the top and on the bottom, but it went in. On the Buccaneers, of course, we have probably my favorite linebacker of all time, Derek Brooks. And we had Simeon Rice. This was back when the Buccaneers were not what they are today. Rondé Barber, Booger McFarland. I can go on with this Buccaneers roster. Now, this is back when Kurt Warner, I'm sure we all know his story, he just had a movie made about him. But this is where he tried resurrecting his career with the Cardinals. Yes, they do. They have Larry Fitzgerald and Anquan Bolden. The dynamic duo were both in this game. We had Antonio Gates, Phillip Rivers, back before he retired, and LaDainian Tomlinson, one of the best running backs in NFL history, was still in this game, still in this era. Now, Tony G is probably the best of the best when it comes to tight ends all time. Trent Green was somehow still relevant at this time in 2006. And Will Shields was one of the best guards ever. You have Peyton Manning and Bob Sanders, 299 overalls, which that's the highest you can possibly get. And then you had Marvin Harrison still, Adam Vinatieri, who's at this point won 3 Super Bowls in his career. Yes, Reggie Wayne was still here. The Hall of Famer and NFL Network announcer was playing. This is where Terrell Owens kind of restarted his career, but also became probably the biggest crybaby in NFL history. On the Dolphins, they were actually a really good team because they had Pro Bowlers and Hall of Famers Jason Taylor and Zach Thomas. The Eagles had Weapon X, Brian Dawkins, David Akers, and Donovan McNabb that were really good. Atlanta has had some good players like Keith Brooking, Algie Crumpler, Patrick Kearney, who actually ended up being a Seahawk the year after this. Yeah, let's just skip over this guy. for the 49ers, they had a okay team this season. But of players I remember the best, it's actually this guy, their punter, Joe Nedney. On the Giants, of course, you had Hall of Famers Michael Strahan, and who should be in the Hall of Fame, Tiki Barber. This Giants team you see in front of you is basically the team that won the Super Bowl against New England. Jacksonville was on top. They had good players all around. Byron Leftwich, who was actually the Buccaneers offensive coordinator. At running back, they had Fragile Freddy and Maurice Jones-Drew. Greg Lewis, who is probably my favorite fullback in the game, other than one other person we're going to see in a minute. Rashean Mathis, one of the most dangerous kick returners of the 2000s. On the Jets, Sean Ellis was a pretty big beast on defense. Jonathan Vilma, who is actually a commentator these days, was on top of his game. Curtis Martin, one of the all-time best running backs in Jet history, is here. So is Lavernius Coles. DeBrickashaw Ferguson was a rookie. On the Lions, there weren't too many big-name guys other than Trey Bly. The Packers, we still had guys. Chad Clifton, who was a great offensive lineman. Al Harris, who single-handedly ended one of my favorite playoff games of all time at free safety. Donald Driver, who is a really good player that's underrated. And this man, recently he's been in controversy. But at the time, he was the greatest quarterback in Packer history. And also, look who's right behind him. Here on Carolina, there are so many great players I can name because they would not shut up about the Panthers. From guys like Steve Smith, to Julius Peppers, even guys like Ken Lucas, who was great in Seattle, Chris Jenkins. I could name so many more too. The Patriots, this was the year before they went to the Super Bowl, but of course they had this guy who just retired. If you don't know about him, I don't know what to tell you. You had Richard Seymour, Rodney Harrison, Mike Vrabel, Matt Light, Roosevelt Colvin. Like, this team was stacked back in 2007. This was the year the Patriots went 18-0. On the Raiders, you had some pretty good guys. This is another number in the 99 club. My favorite punter in the game, Shane Leckler, who actually ended up punting for the Texans later in his career. You had Randy Moss. This was the only year I believe he was a Raider. I could be wrong. Derek Burgess, who now has a son and is playing on the Rams. This was back when the St. Louis Rams were a team. You had Torrey Holt, who was pretty big back then. You have Mark Bolger as their quarterback. Orlando Pace. Jeff Wilkins, who is the only kicker in Youngstown State history to make the NFL. The Baltimore Ravens had Ed Reed, who is the last member of the 99 club, I believe, if I can see on the screen. Ray Lewis out of 98. Terrell Suggs, this is only his second year in the league. Chris McAllister, Todd Heap, Trevor Price. Like, this defense was loaded as well. Every team this year was really good. But Chris Cooley was actually listed as a fullback, even though he played tight end in the NFL. You had this man, rest in peace to him as well, who was really good in his short career. The Saints here, with Drew Brees still at quarterback, McAllister and Reggie Bush as a rookie, and you had Michael Bennett. You had three great running backs from this era. Well, Michael Bennett not so much, but I liked him more than most people. And at receiver, you had Joe Horn, whose son JC plays in Carolina. And down here, Devery Henderson. He's probably one of the most underrated receivers to me. I can name you every player from this roster. So let's just go through some of them. We have Walter Jones, Sean Alexander, the cover man, Max Strong, my favorite fullback in the game. Period. Matt Hasselbeck, QB. Daryl Jackson. Marcus Trufant at corner. Grant Wickstrom. Robbie Tobeck. Michael Boulware. And there are so many guys on this team like Kelly Herndon, Josh Brown. Just guys I don't want to show for time issues. But it's an insane team. The Steelers at this point still had Ben Roethlisberger as their quarterback. Sadly, he just retired. You had Fast Willie Parker and Deuce Staley on the roster. They had Hines Ward still and Santonio Holmes back when he was a rookie. Houston still had their first ever quarterback, David Carr. The Titans were a pretty good team at the time. They still had Keith Bullock, who was really good, and Kevin Mawai, who was a big star for the Jets, also a Hall of Famer. They also had Albert Hainsworth, who had one of the biggest contracts in NFL history but didn't pan out. Lastly, on the Vikings, Steve Hutchinson, one of the Seahawks legends, got in the Hall of Fame a couple years ago. We're not going to talk about him either. Probably for better. Matt Burke, who's also one of the best centers. And Antoine Winfield. His son plays with the Bucks. That's how old this game is. Feel it yet? That's about it for rosters. Part 2, we're going to be creating a team.